Hi everyone, I'm Brianna Lemke,
And I'm Sammy Yozam.
and we decided to look into standardized testing for our ethical practices debate. The guiding question that we looked into is, are standardized tests an effective way to measure school performance?
When we talk about standardized tests, we're really talking about any test that's administered, scored, and interpreted in a consistent, predetermined, standard manner. So these include achievement, aptitude, college admissions, internal comparison, international comparison, and psychological tests. These have been a constant component of the American educational system since the mid-1800s and really still continue to be a source of disagreement and debate today. So that's one of the reasons we were really going to look in and dig deeper into this issue. While the data that we collect from these tests can really gauge progress and help us recognize areas that need improvement, we are really interested if they are still considered ethical and if they're really still true measures of school performance, especially when we consider areas of cultural sensitivity and bias, and the emotional well-being of our students. An interesting component to understand why and how we use standardized testing today can be gleaned from looking at the history of the use of standardized testing. We can trace standardized testing back as far in history to the 17th century in China. The government at that time used standardized testing to screen for job applicants so that they got the best candidate, which we can continue to see mirrored in our practices, hiring practices today. When we look back, we saw a number of changes happen in our country around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and standardized testing and education was no different. Before the Industrial Revolution, education was not available for the masses, as many children had to work as farmhands or in factories and other places of employment. But with the Industrial Revolution, more kids were able to access educational opportunities. This meant that the essays that had been widely used as an assessment tool were no longer the best option for measuring large groups of data or large groups of people. So standardized assessments were introduced by Horace Mann and Samuel Howe, starting in the Boston schools. They modeled these assessments used by the Prussian school system, and that was a really centralized school system. So we can see how that corresponds to large standardized assessments. Their purpose of introducing these tests were really to measure the output of each individual school. So the tests were never really developed or never introduced into the American education system as a test of individual students or a measure of individual students, but more as a measure of school accountability and understanding of what is being taught at school. When we think about the modern testing era, I think the environment that we picture when we engage in this debate, we are thinking about the era after 1965 with the enactment of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which President Johnson signed into law in 1965 to make the U.S. Education system more competitive worldwide and accountable. After that, in 1983, we had the Nation at Risk, the Imperative for Educational Reform article come out and call great attention to the need for increased accountability and development of our educational system. After that, every presidential administration has tried to reform schools using a variety of different methods, often increasing the standardized assessments that go along with it. For example, the 2002 No Child Left Behind Act was mandated annual testing, and then also paired it with strict consequences for school districts that didn't make adequate progress or gains, in comparison to President Obama's Race for the Top campaign, which tried to incentivize the positive test scores. In spite of these different attempts and uses of standardized testing, no significant student growth has been measured, and making everything more complicated, testing has become a billion-dollar industry, also raising more questions about the ethical implications. So when we looked at standardized testing, we had two positions. One that, yes, standardized testing is an effective way to measure school performance, and one that, no, it is no longer effective. So first, standardized assessments were created to be objective. That means that they were created to be administered and scored in a predetermined and uniform manner. Most of our assessments that we can gain and data that we can gain in the classroom, measures of student success, are highly subjective, meaning it has a lot of opinion or lenses that we're viewing things through. So using objective data and assessments lets us compare student learning outside of the classroom. If there were no objective assessments or data points, we couldn't be certain that we were comparing the same thing. We could be comparing apples to oranges, or what one person thinks is an apple to what one person thinks is an orange. Because of this, we've been able to compare different populations of data to different places and be sure that we are looking at the same skills. Additionally, standardized tests are often and should be norm referenced with the populations that they are testing in mind. So this really does allow for accurate comparison between student groups. The process of creating and norming a standardized assessment is complex and should be taken very seriously so that invested parties can make informed inferences based on the data. Standardized tests are designed to be inclusive, meaning that many students across all subgroups are included in taking the tests. This means that we've been able to identify achievement gaps, patterns, and areas of weakness that might have just been observed case by case or student by student. But through large groups of these standardized assessments, we are able to accurately see the patterns and alert all stakeholders to these. If we weren't considering our standardized data, patterns and gaps would still exist. We would just not be able to articulate them as accurately as we are. The last area that standardized tests are created with in mind is to provide accountability for the field of education. As was mentioned in the history of standardized assessments, these tests were never meant to focus on individual students, but more to serve as a check of the educational system as a whole. Through sharing the aggregate data, so data that doesn't identify individual students, the community can keep involved and can have input on the education that's occurring within their community. Education is always trying to move forward, and our students deserve continued progress. And that can only happen after we have the illumination that data offers. Goal setting and problem solving can only occur once we decide that there is something to focus on, and standardized data is one way that we can go about making those decisions and finding those areas. Standardized data is also a huge component of resource allocation and policy decisions being made at state, local, and federal levels. When federal lawmakers especially need to make decisions that influence so many kids, they turn to standardized data to see the effects and the influences of different strategies and details or components on a large level. If we didn't have standardized data, there would not be much information coming about at these high levels to make decisions, consequential decisions for all students. Additional considerations for standardized testing include that many professions use a standardized test to gain entry into the field. We should be able to prepare our students for these opportunities. Standardized testing continues to be a fairly accurate predictor of future success in a variety of areas. And educational professionals, including teachers, district administrators, and those higher up in the process, need to understand how to utilize standardized data to impact student learning. Just because the standardized data is not used appropriately doesn't mean that it's the fault of the tool. It could be that the people utilizing it don't have all the tools to understand and make the most use of it. Those are the most important parts of why standardized testing is and continues to be beneficial and necessary for our educational system.
On the other side of the ethical debate is that standardized testing is not an effective way to measure school performance. One of the factors stating that it's not an effective way to measure school performance is the added stress on teachers as well as students. The standardized test is meant to only be one factor of holistic student data, and it is now being used as something much larger. So there is stress on teachers to perform well and teach to the test, as well as stress on students to perform well just on this one measure. Schools that are continuously failing year after year have added pressure to do well on this one test. And it's also time consuming to prepare for and to administer. So that is a lot of instructional time taken just to administer and take this test. The high stakes of standardized testing has a negative impact on the curriculum. One such impact is the narrowing of the curriculum. Subjects such as art and music or science and social studies often get cut or not focused on in comparison to just math and literacy, which we understand that those are very important subjects and should be taking a lot of time, but students are often missing those other well-rounded components of an education. Particularly, students that are not doing well or schools that are not performing well on the standardized assessments often don't get the added benefit of those educational components such as science, social studies, and those subjects. Often when we are just focusing on preparing for standardized testing, our education system is focusing on simple things such as answering the right question or test-taking strategies and not focusing so much on critical thinking, or we're lacking real-life experiences and problem solving. And this isn't preparing our students for their future in college or a career or being community ready. We're missing those components of problem solving and collaborating and creative thinking or project-based learning. And there's also a large mismatch between test and curriculum content. 50 to 80% of what is on standardized tests is not represented in the curriculum being taught. And oftentimes when teachers are teaching to the test, we're missing a large amount of knowledge that we could be giving to our students by just narrowing in on such a small piece of a student's educational journey. There's also a very large correlation between socioeconomic status and test results. Students from advantaged backgrounds perform significantly better on standardized tests due to their stimulus-rich environment and background knowledge, life experiences, which puts students at a disadvantage already just due to their home life or their experiences. Schools and students that have successful testing outcomes often have more opportunities for authentic learning, such as project-based learning or authentic problem-solving experiences, critical thinking skills, whereas students who are not performing well on the test and are unsuccessful at testing have to go through test preparation instead, which is an unfair result and a cyclical widening of the achievement gap. We're seeing then discrepancies of teaching between racially and culturally and economically diverse schools and students, which is unfair and unethical. Because the test is really only meant to be one snapshot of student achievement, we have an incomplete picture when there is so much weight being relied upon on just one data point. There's bias against participants such as language learners and students with disabilities. The standardized tests are not culturally competent and assume students' knowledge of U.S. cultural customs and a lot of times don't account for certain background knowledge or life experiences. A standardized test does not encompass multiple intelligences, so we are always getting a full representative picture of what a student can do or the daily successes and growth that individual students have. So it's unfair to rely so heavily upon just one piece of information to make such impactful decisions. Our takeaways, something that I really gained from doing this research is that all students deserve an authentic education experience regardless of their test scores. It's unfair and unethical to limit a student's educational opportunities to test preparation just because they aren't doing well on the test and because that test is so heavily relied upon. Standardized tests should only be one data point and not the end-all be-all to make decisions.
My first takeaway mirrored a lot of Brianna's. standardized testing or standardized data should just be one aspect of holistic student data when we are deciding, when we are making decisions that impact instruction and student outcomes. We really need to be looking at the whole picture of a student, not just one aspect and one snapshot, especially when we consider some of the ethical implications of standardized testing. We need to look at that in a holistic way, understanding what the data represents and what it doesn't. When appropriate value is placed on testing data, it can reveal influential information. We can use this data to start the process of making great changes and making informed decisions that can have really positive effects on students and their educational outcomes, but we need to know how to do it and we need to use it appropriately. Inappropriate use of this data is unethical and will ultimately hurt students.
So our overall position from this research and analyzing this ethical debate of standardized testing is that standardized testing is one necessary component of holistic student data, but these assessments should continue to evolve to reflect the needs of culturally responsive educators and diverse students.
So when we were thinking about what we took away from this process, we were thinking about how we could implement this in our current jobs and maybe give some examples for you all to consider in your practice. So I highlighted my school's report card data from 2015 to 18, and I'm going to walk us through the process that we used to use standardized data and different data points to inform our instruction. First, we noticed that we identified the pattern that our students with disabilities, I'm a special education teacher, so those are the kiddos that I focus on, had really a significant gap, especially between students with disabilities who were advanced or proficient and students without disabilities, or just the entire school who are advanced or proficient. This gap continued for 3 years, actually becoming worse as we moved forward. So this really alerted us that we needed to look at what we have been doing these 3 years, because something in there was not serving our students with disabilities to the best way possible. We also had the same kind of phenomenon or the same data occurring in math. So we ended up working with both the ELA and math PLC teams during our summer data institute to dig down deep. So this was the snapshot of our data. This is what the numbers we were looking at. And that helped us inform our school improvement plan. So this is how we took the data and made it into a working plan for our team. We decided that we needed our students to grow. So we were going to start working in reading and ELA, because we felt like those benefits could be felt throughout the students' educational experience. And we also aligned it with the district's strategic plan. They've set the focus on reading first, closing that gap, and really then expanding from there. We also considered different sources of data. So we looked at the BAS, which is a running record, which is more of a subjective measure of student reading, but it's more personalized. So that's the personal and the holistic use of data. We decided what our mid-year target was going to be, and how we were still considering how we need to progress monitor. And then these were the action steps that we went through to determine our next steps so like to facilitate this goal. These are just like really specific steps that we did. We continued to center the use of data to inform the decisions that we made next and which action steps that we added. We added in like material review. So we were looking at what programs and what strategies were we using that weren't really meeting the needs of students. And we were systematically incorporating new systems and strategies into our teaching during these next couple years and monitoring the change and the effect of that for students. One other data point that I thought about and I've looked at differently with my new understanding of standardized data is the STAR report. This is an example of a STAR report for our 6th grade general education students. And so we're looking at standards. If we were to click on, we could drill down and correlate them to specific Common Core state standards. This gives us like our subject or our overview, and we can really easily see where most of our students are at this time. So when it can really help us focus our data. So during our intervention periods, like we're going to hit most of these standards again in our general education curriculum throughout by the end of the year. These are the standards that we need to look at and strategically problem solve around, especially during like tier 2 and tier 3 intervention periods. So this is, again, just one way that we're using a standardized set of data, and then we can drill down and make decisions, informed decisions. Here are our references. We did have a couple that we wanted to highlight, especially while we're entering testing season and when we think about what contributions we want to bring back to our own classrooms. I got a variety of information from the Data Quality Campaign, and this infographic about who uses student data I thought was very informative because it can show the different types. I liked how it broke down the different types of assessments that we can use. And then also just, it really did a nice job of delineating what is the proper terminology for different types of data.
And a resource that was really impactful for me was a TED Talk. It was an educational advocate named Ted Dintersmith, and he was inspired to create change by looking into his own children's education. He wanted to make a list of things that his children were doing that were just school specific and educational experiences that they were participating in that would prepare them for the future. And he was sad to discover that his children were participating mostly in activities that would prepare them for standardized tests or just school-specific tasks, and not engaging in authentic, real-life problem-solving experiences. And so he and a team of filmmakers went around to schools that were providing authentic experiences, and he was advocating for this change, and let's show people what educators and students are capable of if we give them that freedom instead of that pressure to perform to a standardized test. And he noted that our global competition of trying to keep up with countries such as South Korea, just with that international data, is failing our students, that we need to provide an ethical and engaging educational experience in order to prepare our students for this ever-changing world, instead of focusing solely on standardized testing assessment. So to close, an impactful quote that we thought really summed up this ethical debate of standardized testing is from Carol Dweck, and she states that test scores and measures of achievement tell you where a student is, but they don't tell you where a student could end up. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation.